following this intimate and fascinating account of the life of Elizabeth, the Queen Mother in love.
The nation has a very clear view of the character of the Queen Mother. She was Britain's favourite grandmother, a smiling image of what it meant to be royal.
She did have a velvet glove. She had velvet suits. She had velvet parasols. She was very much a velvet queen. But by God, didn't she have a steely fist underneath?
This steely attitude could be seen throughout her life. But the Queen Mother's story could have been very different. As a young woman, her love life was turbulent. She became so close to the glamorous Prince of Wales, the future Edward VIII, that their marriage was publicly predicted. And yet, through duty, she married the awkward younger brother, Prince Bertie.
This was a very nice young man who adored her, who had a public role to play, and she could do worse. But I don't think she was in love with him.
It was the choices the Queen Mother made in love, along with a passionate hatred for another woman, that shaped the future of the British monarchy. In the first summer of peace after the horrors of the First World War, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon turned 19. The British upper classes were determined to return to their old ways. There would be presentations at court, balls, shooting parties, and races. For the young Lady Elizabeth, it was her chance to make an impression on society.
She was regarded as quite a flirt and a bit of a tease.
She did have this star quality, there's no question about it, and she rode well to hounds and she danced well.
She was known as the best dancer in London.
She was young, she was fun-loving, she was good company.
And she would have made the perfect wife for any aristocrat. And there's a story that in 1 year alone she had 5 proposals of marriage, all of which she rejected.
Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon emerged glittering onto the upper-class social scene as the youngest daughter of a Scottish aristocratic family. She was born in 1900, at the dawn of a new century. As the 9th of 10 children, she slotted into a large and happy family.
Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had a magical childhood. An Edwardian country childhood.
They lived mainly at St Paul's, Waldenbury in Hertfordshire, and then they used to come north to Glamis, particularly in the summer, and there are 1 or 2 other houses as well which they visited on the way. The Queen Mother always used to say, we followed the birds, so whatever was in season that needed to be shot at any particular time, the family would sort of gravitate to that particular part of the world.
Elizabeth may have had a fairy tale childhood, but her mother made sure she understood the privileged world she lived in.
Her mother's influence was enormous on Elizabeth. Her mother not only taught her to read and write, but she inculcated in her a very, very strong sense of religious principle and duty.
The Bowes-Lyons made their money out of coal, out of miners losing their lives and getting injured underground in Durham. But Elizabeth was taught there was a price to pay for that. It's very interesting to look at the local Dundee newspapers and the way in which the Bowes-Lyons, or the Strathmores as their title was, were forever inviting the folks from the village up to the house. And we can read about this little girl, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, at a very early age, 4, 5, 6 years old, and the local reporters saying, oh, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, particularly charming, and how nice she was.
This charmed world came to an abrupt end on Elizabeth's 14th birthday, the day Britain entered the First World War. Elizabeth's brothers, like most aristocratic young men, joined up, and the rest of the family helped the war effort at home.
Glamis became a convalescent home. She didn't nurse the soldiers, that's a misconception, but she did help them write letters to their girlfriends, buy them cigarettes, talk to them, play cards with them.
But Elizabeth attracted attention not simply for her girlish charm. She also possessed a charisma and self-confidence well beyond her years.
Well, during the war, there was a fire at Glamis, and she supervised the carrying out of all the heirlooms, and she did this in a rather imperious manner, gave orders in a rather imperious manner, and the head of the Forfar Fire Brigade said afterwards, "Who's yon prude lassie?" So there was a tough element there, even when young.
By the time the war ended in 1918, one of Elizabeth's brothers had been killed, and another returned permanently damaged by shell shock. Elizabeth was molded by her experience of war. Unwritten codes of duty and sacrifice governed the lives of people of her class. It was a lesson Elizabeth would never forget. Despite these experiences, Elizabeth was still only 18, and like most of the nation, longed for a return to normal life. In common with other aristocratic girls of her generation, her main ambition was to meet suitable boys and ultimately make the best possible marriage. She exchanged letters with her friends discussing their latest crushes. "We were in church today, and a beautiful, tall, fair lieutenant walked in. Katie is set to marry a sailor, but although I adore them, I think I should never bear my husband to go away for sometimes years at a stretch. Have you been behaving yourself well lately? Please tell me the truth. Do you have dozens of male visitors to see you every day?" What was known as the season had been suspended during the war. And so Elizabeth's first chance to experience this round of presentations, balls, and introductions came in 1919.
The season was the summer months from, I suppose, roughly April, when hunting stopped, to August, when grouse shooting started. It was built round, as everything was in those days, built round the needs of men who were assumed to build their lives round the sporting calendar. Night after night, there would be balls and parties in every grand house in London, virtually. And then, at the beginning of August, it would completely end. People would go off either to Cowes for sailing, yachting, or they would go up to Scotland for the glorious 12th, when grouse shooting started.
The pinnacle of a girl's season was to be presented at court. Elizabeth was presented at Holyrood Palace. And afterwards a friend wrote, "Elizabeth is out now, and Cecilia has had a dance for her. How many hearts will Elizabeth break?"
She knew how to talk to men. She was not scared of men. She had older brothers. She'd always been loved and really admired. And she had the sort of confidence that she was able to get on with men.
This self-assurance that she had comes through. And if you're self-assured, then you can face the world, and you can just be great fun and enjoy your season, enjoy being there. And I don't doubt for one moment that that's precisely what she did.
And there were a lot of men. That I do know. Viscount Gage was one man who was said to be sick with love over her.
But it was another young man who would steal Elizabeth's heart. The dashing younger son of the Earl of Murray, James Stuart.
He was a war hero. He had everything that would make a young woman find him attractive. He was tall, he was 6'1", he had blue eyes, he had wonderful chiseled, rather hawk-like features. He won 2 military crosses, and of course he was irresistible.
Elizabeth's friendship with James would change the course of her life. James had a post at Buckingham Palace working for one of the royal princes, and it was through him that Elizabeth came in closer contact with the premier family in the land, the Windsors. This was a family who would dominate Elizabeth's life, but ultimately, it was she who would shape their future. In 1919, George V and Queen Mary had been on the throne 9 years. They had 5 surviving children, Princess Mary and Princes Edward, Albert, Henry, and George. For all young debutantes, it was the eldest boy and heir to the throne who interested them the most.
The Prince of Wales was, without any doubt, the most eligible unmarried man in the British Isles, probably in the world. I would think it supremely unlikely that Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon did not gossip with her friends about the fact that he was on the loose and speculate who would marry him and even play with the idea of, could I have a walk out with him myself?
Even without the allure of being heir to the throne, the Prince of Wales had plenty of other qualities to win a young girl's heart. He was good-looking, had served admirably in the war, and was naturally charming.
On the face of it, the Prince of Wales is the royal celebrity to end them all. I mean, really, Diana had nothing on this guy.
He was the person with the charisma and the presence and really the gold dust of royalty, and it was there, it was in his hair.
Elizabeth may have dreamt of the Prince of Wales, but it was actually his younger brother, Prince Albert, or Bertie, who first noticed Elizabeth. Her suitor, James Stuart, worked as a query or companion to Bertie, and so before long the three of them found themselves together at a ball.
In June 1920, Lord and Lady Farquhar gave a ball in their huge house, number 7 Grosvenor Square. Lord Farquhar was immensely rich, so the ball was absolutely slap-up and marvellous. They had 60 people to dinner, seated at 3 different tables. The entertaining suite of rooms was hung with Aubusson tapestries. He had a wonderful collection of miniatures, and everywhere you looked there were vases of sweet peas which had this wonderful fragrance. After dinner, 150 people came in to dance, and Elizabeth, who was wearing one of her lovely white dresses, was dancing with Jamie Stuart, and Prince Bertie looked across and saw her, and then he called Stuart, and he said, "Will you introduce me, please?" And Jamie Stuart had to introduce him to Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, and Prince Bertie said that that was the moment he really fell in love with her.
Elizabeth wasn't immediately smitten by the 25-year-old Prince Bertie. He was poor in comparison to his older brother. He was neither heir to the throne, nor possessed the charm of the Prince of Wales.
Bertie was a kind of ugly duckling, really. Elizabeth was uneasy about Bertie simply because he was so inept. He was so lacking in confidence. He didn't seem to be very much fun. He was earnest. He was shy. She felt, I think, that there were other fish in the sea, and she had got other admirers.
Elizabeth may have been flattered by Prince Bertie's attention, but she was only 20 years old and already had a string of admirers. There was no rush for her to settle down, and what was to stop her holding out to see if she could catch the biggest fish of all, the Prince of Wales himself? By the time Elizabeth was 20, she had come to the attention of the British royal family. a family that was to dominate the rest of her life. However, when Elizabeth first met the Windsors, it was by no means clear that she would marry one of them, and if she were to, which prince she would choose. While to the world the Windsors exuded the allure of royalty, within the family there were tensions, particularly between the children and their father, George V.
He was quintessentially conservative. He had old-fashioned ideas about things like only bounders ride motorbicycles and no gentleman goes to Scotland in January. Strange, archaic views. The main issue between the father, George V, and the children was that their clothes must be absolutely impeccable at all times. He treated his offspring extraordinarily brutally. George V once said that his father had been frightened of his mother, that's to say, Edward VII had been frightened of Queen Victoria. He, George V, had been frightened of his father, Edward VII, and he was damn sure that he was going to make his children frightened of him.
This harsh upbringing had a profound effect on the 25-year-old prince whom Elizabeth met.
Prince Bertie wasn't at all attractive to Elizabeth when he first met her. He had a lot of strikes against him. He wasn't as bright as his older brother, and he was anyway younger, and he strained to keep up, and of course he was, I think, left-handed. He was made to use his right hand, so he began to stutter. His legs had been put in splints. When he grew up, he had these tremendous fits of temper, partly, I think, due to all this kind of frustration. He had a bit of a drink problem. To a young girl of 19, he would not have been her pin-up.
It was an awkward situation. Elizabeth was smitten by the handsome James Stuart, but his boss, Bertie, had fallen for Elizabeth. James had little choice but to give way to his royal employer. In September, when James was invited to a house party at Glamis, Bertie tagged along.
She was very, very anxious not to be left alone with him in the evening, and when her other girlfriends, if they went off to bed, she would give anxious signs and signals, and on one occasion they all went for a walk, and all the other girls hung back and thinking that that was the appropriate thing to do, and that would have made her nervous. So I don't think that there's any evidence at all to think that she was nearly as struck by him as he was by her.
One of Elizabeth's friends recalled the weekend in her diary. We all went out for a walk this morning after breakfast in the bitter cold. Elizabeth and Prince Albert were allowed to go on miles ahead, which agitated the former rather, but we thought ourselves rather tactful. If Elizabeth couldn't see much in Bertie, Bertie had fallen head over heels for the young Elizabeth.
There's no question that he was smitten by Elizabeth. She was perfect in every way that you could think of. She was charming. She was socially extraordinarily adept, quite the reverse of what he was. He couldn't really cope at all. He was shy, and she was relaxed.
One quality that Bertie did have in abundance was persistence.
Bertie courted Elizabeth for quite some time without ever having the courage to pop the question, partly because she always tried, I think, to keep a certain distance between them.
He tried to seek her out at various dances. He tried to get himself asked to house parties at which she was. He would try and hold her hand, which she would remove. He followed her round.
And he did finally propose to her, and she said no, and he was absolutely devastated.
One of the key reasons, of course, why she wasn't so struck by him was because she was very much more struck by James Stuart at this point.
Elizabeth was far keener on the poorer but more dashing equerry James Stuart than his awkward royal boss. But Bertie didn't give up. He had decided that Elizabeth should be his wife, and his parents were beginning to show an interest.
It was very much thought, I think, that get these princes settled as quickly as possible, because if they're not settled, they're going to be racketing about the town, they're going to get into trouble, they're going to form unsuitable liaisons. So let's get Bertie settled as quickly as we can.
In the past, British princes would have married foreign princesses, often from the German royal family. But the First World War changed all this. Now all things German were viewed with suspicion.
In the early part of 1917, London was bombed for the first time by flights of aeroplanes. These aeroplanes were Gotha bombers, and those who looked into the royal history discovered that the surname of George V was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. So this was clearly an impossibility, and it was in 1917, accordingly, that George V changed the family name from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha to the superlatively English Windsor.
Changing their name wasn't the only break with German tradition. George V was also forced to look closer to home to arrange marriages for his children. The Windsors were in uncharted territory and wanted to make sure their sons found suitable wives. Queen Mary was a formidable figure, a German princess who would always put duty before happiness. She had already vetted previous potential wives for her sons and rejected them. Would Elizabeth stand up to the Queen's scrutiny?
Queen Mary went to stay with her great friend Mabel Airlie, really in order that she could go across and have a look at this girl that Bertie was so keen on. It was arranged that Queen Mary would drive across to Glamis to see Lady Strathmore. As it happened, Lady Strathmore was ill, genuinely ill, that day, and Elizabeth had to deputise for her mother. And she did it faultlessly, with great charm, self-confidence, good manners, all the things that had been drilled into her. And at the end of the visit, Queen Mary thought, this is the girl for my son. Nothing must be allowed to stand in the way.
Elizabeth had passed a test that she didn't even want to sit. She had already turned Bertie down once. But Queen Mary was a force to be reckoned with. She took steps to smooth the path for Bertie. She decided that his rival suitor, James Stuart, must be removed.
James Stuart was then offered a job by Sidney Greville in the oil fields of Oklahoma, and so off he went. And Sidney Greville was the brother of Queen Mary's lady-in-waiting at the time. So I don't think it's very difficult to see how that happened.
Queen Mary may have got rid of James, but she couldn't make Bertie any more attractive to Elizabeth. In the new year of 1922, Bertie proposed again. Once again, Elizabeth said no.
I don't think it would have been hard for Elizabeth to refuse a royal prince, because I think she was a fiercely independent person. I don't think the idea of becoming a royal highness or a duchess or a princess meant a tremendous amount to her, because, you know, although the word commoner is bandied about in relation to her, this is actually very misleading, because she'd had this incredibly grand upbringing.
With this supreme confidence and self-assurance, why should Elizabeth and her family settle on the runner-up and not aim for the most eligible bachelor in the land?
Presumably at some point it also passed through the mind of Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon herself, because if you did get the vibe that you were sort of destined for a royal match, which would you choose? The stammering, very nice but slightly perhaps seemingly dull, worthy second son, or the dashing heir to the throne who everybody was mad about?
There's no question at all that this was in the minds of various of her friends, because they were pulling her leg about it, and perhaps in her own mind as well.
Many, many years ago, I knew somebody called Rosemary Olivia who told me that she remembered seeing Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon and the Prince of Wales, what's called sitting out together at the dance, laughing their heads off in such a way as you could well have supposed that romance was in the air.
All through the autumn, the rumour grew that the crush young Elizabeth had on the debonair Edward was blossoming into something more serious. The whispers were that the biggest catch of all was soon to be landed. And while it remained as gossip within the closed world of the society set, the relationship could bloom at its own pace. But then suddenly, Fleet Street took the whispered news and exploded it. On the 5th of January 1923, the Daily News announced, "A Scottish bride for the Prince of Wales. The future Queen of England is the daughter of a well-known Scottish peer, who is the owner of castles both north and south of the Tweed." Elizabeth wasn't named, but everybody knew the article referred to her. It seemed that she had won the glittering prize. But the fairy tale didn't last long. This was not the match that Queen Mary had planned. 2 days later, the palace took the unusual step of denying the story. The humiliation for Elizabeth was public. A week after that, the ever-persistent Bertie went to visit Elizabeth.
They walked down the garden and they went into the little wood at the end, leafless, because this, I think it was in January. There he proposed, and Elizabeth said yes.
Why? Was she frightened? Did she then accept the inevitable? Did she think she was going to upset her mother? Was she going to lose both of them? Was her name going to be besmirched in the popular press or anything like that? I think this announcement and this whole thing panicked her into it.
I think she did have her eye on the main chance. She was bold enough to say, on 2 occasions, no. And on the 3rd occasion, I think with the idea that there was no chance of becoming Princess of Wales, that her parents were pushing her, that there was pressure coming from Queen Mary, she eventually, on the 3rd occasion, said yes.
This was a very nice young man who adored her, who had a public role to play, and she could do worse. And I think eventually that view prevailed. But I don't think she was in love with him.
For Elizabeth, there was no turning back. She was about to join the Windsor dynasty, and from now on she would lead the life of a royal duchess. She wrote to her brother, "I could hear the door clanging behind me, never to open again." Having been feted as a debutante, courted by many men, and come close to becoming a bride for the Prince of Wales, at the age of 23, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had made her choice. She would marry the second in line to the throne, Prince Albert.
Her character was such that once she had taken something on, and so once she had agreed to marry the Duke of York, then that was it, and she was going to absolutely do her bit by him.
She had this great gift of making the best of her life, and in a way she was determined to be happy.
But this wasn't any ordinary marriage. She was marrying into an institution, and it was one which was in a state of flux.
The First World War really brought monarchy crashing down in ruins all over Europe. Obviously, the empires of Russia and Germany and Austria, those had always been the bulwarks of European society and politics and everything. So they went. And that created great panic in the 4th remaining monarchy, the British monarchy.
The Windsors were genuinely frightened for their future. They had to find a way to survive. And one way to do this was to appeal directly to the people. They could no longer be distant regal figures. But while they were happy to open up to the public, there were still rules and boundaries about how this was done. Rules Elizabeth had yet to learn.
When a reporter came knocking on her door, she thought it was just like McTavish from the Dundee Telegraph, and there was no harm in talking to him. Come in, have some tea. Oh yes, I'm delighted. And of course, This was in the papers next day and goes up to Sandringham, and the King and the Queen are not best pleased. And that's the last time that she ever opened the door to a reporter. And of course, she learnt more subtle methods.
On the 26th of April 1923, Elizabeth was married to Prince Bertie and became Duchess of York. Before the war, royal weddings had taken place in private chapels. But in keeping with the new public style, the Yorks' wedding took place at Westminster Abbey. Thousands thronged the Mall to catch a glimpse of the bride. This time, Elizabeth struck exactly the right note.
She, right from the beginning, showed this sure-footedness she had right through her life by deciding that she would lay her bridal wreath bouquet on the tomb of the unknown soldier in Westminster Abbey, which obviously even now is a moving gesture. But in those days, it was only a year or so since the search parties had gone out for the different corpses, and they'd chosen the one who was truly unknown and had been brought back, and it was a massive national event, the burial of the unknown soldier. And here she connects right with that on the day of her wedding.
The wedding proved a brilliant start to Elizabeth's new career as Duchess of York. But like all new brides, she had to find a way to deal with her new in-laws.
The wonderful thing about Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon is that she was never afraid of George V. His own children were in fear of him. I mean, if they were 5 minutes late for a meal, they were literally in terror of what he was going to say. She was late on one wonderful occasion and came in and apologized. Said, "I'm so sorry, Papa, I'm afraid we're a few minutes late." He said, "Not at all, my dear, we must have sat down 5 minutes too early." He was absolutely beguiled by her.
His admiration only increased when Elizabeth began her public duties. She seemed to charm the British public just as naturally as she had her father-in-law.
She took to public life as if she'd been born to it. Partly, I suspect, it was because she was used to performing. Partly, it was because of her own confidence in herself. And partly, it was because of the fact that she was used to mixing with ordinary people. And she actually liked ordinary people and was interested in them. She learned how to pose for cameras. She learned to know what newsreels wanted. She learned that famous wave, that famous slow wave that people always noticed about her. She learned these things as she went along, but it was all done instinctively. I don't think it was ever taught.
Elizabeth was relaxed in front of the camera. She actually almost sort of flirted with the camera, whereas Bertie tried to get away from the camera. He was embarrassed by it. In public situations, she said, "You must wave, Bertie." When he went into the coach and pulled all the blinds down, he didn't want to wave. He found it agonizing to take part in public engagements, and when he had to give a speech, it was really most embarrassing because he just couldn't get the words out.
Elizabeth was the most enormous help to Bertie. She found him a voice teacher which cured his stutter. Once he could speak without stuttering, of course, a lot of the frustrations dropped away. If he seemed to get into a temper, she would tap his wrist and really laugh him out of it, with the result that he became a much more relaxed, nicer, and happier person.
The press nicknamed Elizabeth the Smiling Duchess. And while she was working hard to make the royals popular at home, her brother-in-law, the Prince of Wales, was doing a similar job abroad.
He was sent on these endless tours around the Commonwealth to see the world and also to let the world see him, to tighten the bonds of empire, to emphasize the fact that he would be king not just of Great Britain, but also of all these other countries painted pink around the world, and he was a phenomenal success.
The public loved him. The Times correspondent wrote of his tour of Canada, "Some of his speeches he reads, sometimes he just talks as a friend to friends. When he is on his feet, he loses all self-consciousness. He has a happy knack of saying the right thing in the right way, and his clear, boyish voice has a quality of sympathy and sincerity."
The Prince of Wales had the common touch, the ability to walk into a room packed with coal miners or stockbrokers or private soldiers, and within 10 minutes be the life and soul of the party, sitting at piano, strumming away, joining in with them, singing, cracking jokes with them. He could handle the personal relationships superbly well.
But unlike Elizabeth, one relationship he didn't handle well was the one with his father, George V.
As long as his father lived, he was Prince of Wales and he hadn't got a proper job. There was always, right back to the 18th century, there's always been a rivalry between the person on the throne and his or her heir.
Ever since the princes had been children, George V had been obsessive about their appearance. Now a young man, Edward might have been a fashion icon to his generation, but his father didn't approve.
He adopted turn-ups to his trousers, and George V got absolutely livid when he appeared in turn-ups and sort of said, "Is it raining? Is it raining out? Is it raining? What do you mean by having these turn-ups?" And he really regarded his son, his eldest son, as what he called a cad. You dress like a cad, you behave like a cad, you are a cad, get out, he said on one famous occasion.
Despite this, Elizabeth remained close to her brother-in-law. She wrote to him sympathizing about life at court. "I know now your feelings of relief and freedom when you get away from England on your own, away from the petty little annoyances and restrictions that drive one crazy, being always under the eye of a narrow-minded autocrat." While Edward rebelled, Bertie towed his father's line. He had not only married the right sort of girl, but in 1926 they had their first child, also named Elizabeth. No one then would have predicted that she would one day become queen. But along with her sister Margaret, born 4 years later, they became the darlings of the nation.
The public adored them, approved of the Yorks because they thought they were a very good family couple, adored the princesses, who were, of course, national icons, more than any movie star.
Visitors to the royal tournament, Princess Margaret Rose and Princess Elizabeth. Like so many other parents, the Duke and Duchess of York bring their two little girls to see the big spectacle at Olympia.
We've seen in our own times, in the 80s, how the royal family is doing best when it is a young royal family. Well, in the 1920s, George V and Queen Mary are middle-aged. Not very interesting, but along come this lovely little group, the Yorks. And it resonates so well with the national experience. These are the years when the council houses are getting built, when the suburban estates, the semi-detached, are springing up all over the land, and people are drinking their Horlickses and listening to the radio in family groups. And so the Yorks are just ideal for this.
So ironically, a very grand family was suddenly acclaimed by the public as the emblems of suburban ordinariness.
When they weren't doing their public duties, they did extraordinarily little with their life. They lived a kind of country life existence with jigsaw puzzles and the usual sort of round of hunting and shooting and fishing. And when she didn't have public duties to perform, she got up at 11 o'clock. And they did nothing for themselves if they could ring a bell and get somebody to do it for them.
As Elizabeth settled into this cozy family life, she still kept up a flirtatious correspondence with her brother-in-law.
The Duchess of York had had a very, very close relationship with her brother-in-law. In one letter she writes, you're very, very naughty and delicious, which is not quite the usual language you would expect from your sister-in-law.
But the life Edward was leading could not have been more different from the married life of the Yorks. Edward was a long way from settling down.
He was sexually acquisitive, let us say, and fairly early on in the Commonwealth tours, he began to pick up the habit of finding an attractive girl at a party and disappearing for an hour and reappearing looking slightly sheepish an hour later. And by the time that the courtiers really were getting worried about him, it had become I think a weakness is the only word.
Edward and Bertie had been close as young men, but now their paths diverged. Luckily for Edward, he had another brother to spend time with. Prince George, the Duke of Kent, was the most cultured of the brothers. He took an interest in music and the arts.
My first memory of any of the royals was when I was about 9, I think it was, with my mother. And she and the Duke of Kent were doing the Times crossword puzzle together and dashing it off at high speed. But I remember that the Duke of Kent was wearing quite a strong perfume. And I remember even at the age of 9, which I suppose I was at the time, thinking it rather strange that this man was smelling so sweetly.
Prince George was drawn to bohemian and unconventional people. Edward, 8 years his senior, introduced his brother to a glamorous nocturnal world.
It was nightclubs and dancing and a lot of theatrical people. They were friends with Fred Astaire and his sister Adele Astaire. They moved in that kind of glamorous, racy set. George was famously not safe in taxis with anybody of either sex. You know, they were rich and they were having fun and they were going to parties and they went for it.
Prince George indulged in all kinds of pleasures without restraint. In 1928, he became addicted to cocaine and morphine.
The Prince of Wales felt genuinely protective towards his younger brother, and when the Duke of Kent got into fearful trouble with drink and drugs and scandals began to revolve around his name, the Prince of Wales put himself to endless trouble to look after his younger brother.
Edward took it upon himself to deal with George's drug addiction.
He then took George down to the country to his house and stayed with him and sat through the whole business of the withdrawal.
When Edward nursed his brother through the cold turkey of coming off morphine, even his father appreciated it. But in one important respect, there was still a tension. Among all the other children, Edward stood out as resolutely single. Princess Mary had married in 1922, Bertie and Elizabeth in 1923. Henry was still single, but was 6 years younger than Edward. And in 1934, even the ex-drug addict Prince George seemed to have settled on a wife, Princess Marina of Greece.
She had a kind of impeccable background to become a member of the English royal family, much more so than Elizabeth, actually. She was famously beautiful and amazingly chic.
When Prince George and Marina got engaged in 1934, Elizabeth didn't take to her glamorous, ice-cool future sister-in-law.
They never really got on, Marina and Elizabeth. Elizabeth probably slightly resented this 11 years into her marriage. George, who's always been a bit wayward and maybe she might have thought him a bit spoiled and obviously behaved badly, brings home this bride who is more beautiful, better turned out, more royal, and immediately everybody fell in love with her, and I think there was an element of jealousy. And they both sneered at each other. You know, Marina apparently called her that common little Scottish girl.
Marina may not have been Elizabeth's choice, but at least she fitted easily into the British royal family. However, there was another woman waiting in the wings who was far more of a threat to Elizabeth and who would never fit in. It was at George and Marina's engagement ball that Elizabeth first came face to face with Edward's latest mistress, Wallis Simpson.
Wallis, wearing violet lame, which was perhaps not the most usual outfit for a Buckingham Palace ball, with a lime green sash. And Lady Hardinge told me in later years, and she was present, that when she was taken up by the Prince of Wales to be presented to the Duchess of York, Elizabeth had this cool, appraising glance which went over Mrs. Simpson. And from that first moment, it was evident to the people who knew her that she didn't like her, and that she thought this was someone who was quite possibly going to rock the boat.
In 1934, Elizabeth and Bertie had been married for 11 years. Her feelings for the man she had accepted for the sake of duty had now turned into a solid marriage. They lived a family life, dividing their time between London and their country retreat, Royal Lodge in Windsor. Elizabeth's relationship with her brother-in-law Edward had settled into a close family friendship. But her feelings for his new mistress, Wallis Simpson, would gradually blossom into a pure and lasting hatred.
The Yorks had enjoyed a very harmonious, very affectionate relationship with the Prince of Wales. He used to come over to Royal Lodge and play with the princesses, who actually loved him. He was their favourite uncle. They were on very close terms. Then Mrs. Simpson came along, and overnight the scene changed.
When Wallis Simpson first came to the Yorks' attention, she was the 38-year-old American wife of a businessman, Ernest Simpson.
Elizabeth and Wallis were, I think, chalk and cheese. They were different in almost every particular. Wallis was very sharp-edged, very American, angular, tailored, crisp.
She did not give a damn about the fact that he was semi-divine almost. To her, he was just a man with an immense potential for giving her jewellery and getting her asked to interesting places. And she treated him like dirt, and he loved it.
I certainly couldn't understand what on earth the Prince of Wales saw in her. To my mind, she wasn't particularly pretty. She was quite tough, wisecracking. And no, really, I have to say I didn't see the point of her at all, but somehow she struck a note in him that nobody else had succeeded in striking. What it was remains to me the mystery to this day.
Yes, well, I met Wallis at Fort Belvedere. We sat down to lunch, and he got up to carve the Sunday joint, the sideboard, which he always liked doing. And she got up and pushed him aside and said, "Go back to your table, sir. You know, I'm going to do it." And I thought he would be annoyed, but he was absolutely delighted. Sat down, and I can't remember exactly what he said, but he said, "Oh, Wallis is so wonderful. She can do anything."
It was not unusual for a royal prince to have a married mistress. Edward himself had had a relationship with a married woman for the last 16 years, but it was always done discreetly. However, through 1935, Edward pursued Wallis relentlessly. He was obsessed by her and displayed it openly.
Well, the Prince of Wales bought her such opulent jewels that people actually, one woman who knew quite a lot about jewellery, thought they were costume jewels. They couldn't quite believe, you know, he bought her emeralds the size of birds' eggs, hundreds of thousands of pounds in pre-war money. You're talking of millions by today's standards.
Elizabeth watched as Wallis began to exert a hold over Edward that she herself had never achieved. Worse still, George V was gravely ill. If Edward carried on his affair with Wallis so flagrantly when he was called upon to be king, it would be even more inappropriate. On January the 20th, 1936, the inevitable happened. George V died and Edward succeeded. Everybody waited to see what kind of king he would become.
Edward thought that he could divide his life into his private life and his public life. When he was in public, he did what he called kinging. He went and did all the things that kings do in public. But he thought that he could live his private life as he wanted, and on one occasion he jumped out of the window at Buckingham Palace and went off to see Mrs. Simpson, you know, rather than see his private secretary.
I remember being very shocked when I heard he'd taken a taxi to go and see Mrs. Simpson in her flat in London. And I overheard my stepfather saying that to my mother. And I thought, how could a king go round in a taxi?
It became more and more apparent that he was not doing his job. He was not concentrating on the affairs of state. He was not reading his papers. He was not diligent in public appearances. He tended to shuffle off the things that kings ought to do onto his brothers.
For Elizabeth, duty always came before pleasure. She found it hard to believe that now Edward was king, his priorities didn't seem to be changing.
Elizabeth doted on Edward partly because she had been fond of him earlier, and partly because he was king. There was a sort of terrific deference, even among royalty, to the person who was actually on the throne.
Elizabeth blamed Wallis, not Edward. She saw Wallis as a malign influence, leading Edward astray.
Of course, it didn't help that various jibes of Wallis against her were constantly being repeated. Wallis was very unkind about her. She used to call her Cookie because she said she had a cook's figure. And Wallis, of course, was string bean thin. She weighed only 7 stone 10. And if she put on half a pound, she would skip a meal.
Wallis's taste was affecting everything, even holidays. While the Yorks took the traditional royal holiday to Scotland, Edward and Wallis shocked the family by going on a cruise round the Mediterranean.
When I was 16, the king rented a yacht. We had a yacht, and we cruised alongside. And I do remember at the time that I thought it rather strange, at the age of 16, that he was, having been king only 6 months, 8 months, was going around the Mediterranean with a lady friend, courting a lady friend who was married, instead of, I would have thought, attending to royal business back in England. He was still King Emperor in those days. We still had India, we still had the Dominions. He was King of Canada, King of Australia. He should have been visiting the Dominions, or he should have been at a Durbar in India 6 months or 8 months after his father died, but not running around the Mediterranean with a twice-married lady.
Elizabeth no doubt felt the same. Edward's obsession with Wallis overshadowed everything, including his royal duties. This became obvious when later that summer he joined the Yorks in Scotland.
Well, I think matters came to a head when the king went to Balmoral, and the Yorks were asked to deputise at this opening of a new Aberdeen infirmary, which the king had chucked because he said he was in court mourning for his father.
And he was then seen at the station meeting Wallis in a 2-seater car, which offended people dreadfully. You see, where Elizabeth and Bertie very much put duty first, I think I would describe the prince as the first of the me generation. Pleasure was what counted. His own wishes and his own personal happiness were really what counted most with him.
Well, the Duchess of York, I think, was furious about this. And this was the moment when I think her disapproval of the situation really hardened.
Elizabeth wrote to Queen Mary that she felt that Edward does not seem to possess the faculty of making others feel wanted. It is very sad, and I feel that the whole difficulty is a certain person. I do not feel that I can make advances to her and ask her to our house, as I imagine would be liked.
There's no doubt at all that she disliked and resented Mrs. Simpson intensely. And the more that Mrs. Simpson became prominent in royal circles, the more the king tried to pass her off as something approaching a consort, the more, both on behalf of her husband and on behalf of the rest of the royal family and on behalf of the country, the more the Duchess of York resented it and felt that it was something which should be checked, if not stopped.
But there was no stopping Edward, and worse was to come. Not content with having Wallis as a mistress, Edward was now determined to make her his wife. Within a few weeks of returning from Scotland, Wallis sued Mr. Simpson for divorce.
In Elizabeth's circle, the attitude divorce was absolutely clear-cut. It was social debt.
You couldn't go to the royal enclosure in Ascot. You weren't received at court anymore. So how could you have a king who's broken the very rules he's supposed to be standing for? And it's the Dominion prime ministers in Canada, Australia, New Zealand who are, in a way, more horrified than anyone in Britain. We can't have our empire represented by this American trollop. Just out of the question.
Edward was now faced with the choice to marry Wallis and give up the throne, or to give up Wallis. Elizabeth was appalled that Edward might be about to place a private relationship above his duty. And all for a woman Elizabeth couldn't stand, and who sneered at her. But most of all, she resented Wallis for the fact that her husband might be forced to be king. Elizabeth, more than anyone, knew how difficult it had been for Bertie to manage the public life he'd had as Duke of York. She doubted that he had the strength to take on the enormous task of stepping into his brother's shoes. Desperate, she wrote to Edward, begging him to be kind to poor Bertie. I am terrified for him. So do help him, and for God's sake don't tell him that I have written.
Happy to feel. Bertie was completely unprepared to be king. He'd had very little exposure to real politics. He knew very little about the Constitution. He hadn't done the big tours, for example, that the Prince of Wales had done. And he simply didn't have the confidence or the personality, he thought, to carry it off.
The king refused to respond to Elizabeth or Bertie's pleas, and withdrew from the whole family as he considered his options. In early December 1936, the country waited to hear if their king would abandon them for Wallis. Elizabeth and Bertie waited too. They were no wiser than the British public. Edward held their future in his hands. For Elizabeth, the strain was enormous. She took to her bed with influenza. Finally, Edward made his decision.
To have given up the throne and abdicated responsibility to his country for a twice-married woman who wasn't actually particularly pretty. I wouldn't have given up a cup of tea for her myself, but there it is, I'm not alone the throne.
Elizabeth's worst fears had come true. On the 11th of December, the ex-king left Britain for self-imposed exile in France. For Elizabeth and Bertie, it was a shattering event.
He went to his mother, and in tears, he was profoundly upset by the terrific and quite unexpected burden of responsibility that now fell on his shoulders.
to suddenly find that your happy family life with your husband and your 2 little girls is going to be turned completely upside down owing to the abdication, it is a traumatic event. I mean, talk about a life change.
It was an upheaval that Elizabeth had neither sought nor wanted. Wallis Simpson was to blame, and Wallis Simpson would have to pay the price. On the 12th of May 1937, Elizabeth and Bertie's lives changed irrevocably when they were crowned king and queen. As if demonstrating his intent to return to a stable reign, Bertie took his father's name and was crowned King George VI. But it would take more than a name change to turn Bertie into a king and to steady the rocking throne. Elizabeth blamed Wallis Simpson for forcing her husband into a role which she feared would destroy him. Bertie was nervous, ill at ease, and the stutter, which he had done so much to overcome, came back under the pressure.
That the plans were being prepared at a time when this country...
It was their duty to make this work. They were going to have to do everything possible to, as they saw it, rescue the monarchy from this great crisis. Bertie thought that they'd all be swinging from lampposts by the end of the week, and that there would be a revolution.
The abdication had tarnished the image of the monarchy. Almost single-handedly, Elizabeth would take on the task of restoring the public's love of the royal family. And she would remake her awkward husband as king. Elizabeth would need all her talents and determination to do this.
I think the key to her success was being a consummate actress. For being able always to feel the pulse of popular opinion and the feeling of the nation.
She was a wonderful public figure. She was made, really, in a whole series of very deliberate propaganda efforts by Cecil Beaton and Norman Hartnell. She was actually sort of dressed and presented to the public, made rather sort of thinner than she actually was in Cecil Beaton's doctored photographs, and made the kind of public face of monarchy.
On their first major overseas tour to Canada and the USA, Elizabeth showed how she would be queen. The style she had been developing since her childhood, mingling with crowds and smiling sweetly, worked wonders to win the approval of the public.
When they came back from their visit, which is a hugely successful visit to America and to Canada, and they came back and they said that that had made them. The crowns were sparkling, the monarchy was safe.
Elizabeth had managed to restore the image of the monarchy in public, but behind the scenes, remaking Bertie as a king was more of a challenge.
The private face of monarchy, it was much more difficult. I mean, she had a terrible time with him. He was given to what was known in the royal household as gnashes or rages. He raged, he lost his temper. Little things, terribly little things, again, often to do with people wearing their clothes in the wrong way, or the medals the wrong way, whatever, caused these terrible rages. And she was very good at trying to calm him down. It didn't always work. Royal servants said that on occasions he actually hit her. She was a battered wife, a battered royal.
There was no possibility that Elizabeth would desert Bertie. Duty and sacrifice were integral to her character. She had stuck by him when he was Duke of York, and however difficult things became, she would now he was king.
Queen Elizabeth became King George's soul, really, during his period as king. She gave him the sort of inner strength, the comfort, the love, and the self-confidence that he needed in order to take on this job.
Elizabeth may have accepted it was her duty to be queen to Bertie's king, but it had put her family under a terrible strain. And she could never forgive the couple who had put her in this position. Shortly after the coronation, Edward had married Wallis in France, but not one of the royal family attended the wedding. Edward and Wallis were now known as the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Although they had the royal surname, they were effectively exiled from the family and Britain.
Abdicated or not, Edward VIII had great charisma and star quality. The new king didn't have great charisma and star quality, and I think they were frankly terrified, and Elizabeth in particular, that he would be overshadowed by his brother.
And there was also the personal element, and I'm quite sure that the personal element was very, very strong. There are lots of hints to the effect that she really loathed Wallis. Certainly, Elizabeth, first of all, avoided Wallis Simpson, and subsequently disliked her intensely, and ultimately carried on a kind of lifelong vendetta against her.
Elizabeth didn't have to work all that hard to make Wallis persona non grata, because a lot of people shared her view that she had robbed them of their king. In fact, in Christmas 1936, the children were singing carols in the street. Hark the herald angels sing, Mrs. Simpson's pinched our king. And she made it clear, and so did the king, that the Windsors would never be received in royal houses in Britain, and that gave a lead to others who might have thought of entertaining them.
Elizabeth froze Wallis out as she pursued her vendetta. People who had been friends of theirs were excluded from Elizabeth's social circle. Wallis was refused the title Her Royal Highness, and so was stigmatized all her life as common rather than royal. On their rare visits to England, Elizabeth refused to meet Wallis. But when the Second World War broke out, it looked like the Windsors might have to return to England for good.
With the country at war, you think there might surely be a family reconciliation. You get Elizabeth writing to her mother-in-law, Queen Mary, what are we going to do about Mrs. S, this being a lady who'd been Duchess of Windsor for 3 years? I personally do not wish to receive her.
Elizabeth was saved from having to do so. A solution was reached between the king and government to send the Windsors to a far-flung corner of the British Empire, making the Duke of Windsor the governor of the Bahamas. But Elizabeth was still not satisfied.
The Queen took it upon herself, Queen Elizabeth took it upon herself to write from Windsor Castle to the minister responsible, who was Lord Lloyd, to say she thought this was a very bad idea and would cause many problems. And she added the words in this letter, "The Duchess of Windsor is regarded as the lowest of the low." Even as the wife of the most humble governor of a British colony, the Duchess would have some sort of official status, and the Queen was determined that she should not have.
It's hard to reconcile this tough, vindictive attitude with the image of Queen Elizabeth during the Second World War. The royal family stayed in London to show their solidarity with the people. Elizabeth and Bertie's morale-boosting visits to the blitzed areas were hugely popular. But here, too, she showed her determination and self-assured attitude.
Well, the impressive thing about Elizabeth is that she would never be told by courtiers what she ought to do. One of the courtiers said, "Ma'am, do you think it entirely right that Your Majesty should wear your best clothes, your best dresses when you go to visit the bomb sites?" And she didn't even hesitate, and she said, "But of course." They would wear their best dresses if they were coming to visit me.
In 1945, victory came, and the King and Queen celebrated with the nation. But for all its success, the war took its toll on George VI. In the years after the war, the King's health deteriorated. Elizabeth was often forced to turn up at events without him. In 1952, he died at the age of 56. Elizabeth was devastated.
Elizabeth always blamed the Duke of Windsor for the death of her husband. She blamed the abdication on the premature death of her husband.
The fact that her husband died 20 years before the Duke of Windsor, in his 50s, having had to take on the role of king, having had to guide the country through a war, having had to take all the responsibilities that should by rights have been his brother's and which he had abandoned for the sake of Wallis Simpson. It's not surprising that there was a deep and abiding hatred and resentment.
Emotionally, perhaps we can understand that, but facing fact, King George VI died of lung cancer.
I went to visit the Duke and Duchess of Windsor in 1971, but when the subject got on to the Queen Mother, they appeared to me to be in fear of her. And when speaking of Queen Elizabeth, they actually lowered their voices in their own house, at which I was astonished. And the Duke said, between these four walls, she was much too fond of me. And the Duchess said, she will never forgive me. And I said, for what? And she said, marrying him.
With George's death, Queen Elizabeth II became queen. Just like her mother at her birth, no one could have predicted that one day she too would be queen. While both Elizabeths seemed to step naturally into their royal roles, the Queen Mother still couldn't forgive the woman who had placed them in this position. In 1967, Elizabeth had no choice but to meet Wallis at a memorial ceremony for Queen Mary.
She was wearing, as I recall, lilac, with a very elaborate hat. I don't think the Queen Mother wanted that meeting, but how could she not attend the unveiling of a plaque to her mother-in-law? So it was forced upon her. So after 30 years as sisters-in-law, these two women came face to face for the first time.
Elizabeth's hatred for Wallis had survived a world war and 30 years of exile. This meeting wasn't the beginning of a reconciliation. While Elizabeth became the nation's favorite grandmother, the Windsors lived out the rest of their years in France. It was only in death that they returned to England. Edward was buried in Windsor in 1972, and 14 years later, Wallis was finally given recognition of a kind when she was buried at her husband's side.
Her coffin was quite plain. I don't even think she was mentioned by name in the funeral service. And of course, the Queen Mother did not go to the grave. The Queen did, the present Queen did, and is said to have shed a tear, which, had Mother been there, would not have been possible.
And that, I suppose, was for her the end of an extremely uncomfortable chapter in her life. She'd seen Wallis, the interloper, out.
Elizabeth was capable of great love. First her passion for the Prince of Wales, and then her protective love for the awkward Bertie. But in the end, it was her hatred for Wallis Simpson that survived them both. Under a haze of chiffon was a steely will that not only froze Wallis Simpson out, but also restored the image of the royal family.
Thank God for Mrs. Simpson. I mean, we would never have had our wonderful king and queen. It was a blessing in disguise.
Our Right Royal Boxing Day continues with the story of a royal love match that met with considerable public resistance. The Queen's wedding is at 10 o'clock tonight on Channel 4. Before that, David Starkey brings his Monarchy series right up to the present day. That's next.